They called him the Fragile One. Among the towering forms of the alien warriors, his presence was almost laughable. Thin, wiry, and standing a full head shorter than most of the competitors, he was an anomaly in the grand arena of Korrath Prime. The tournament was a sacred tradition among the Korrath and their allied species, a proving ground for the galaxy's fiercest combatants. No human had ever set foot on this planet before, let alone dared to enter the tournament. Yet here he stood. His name was Elias Kane. He wasn't a soldier or a trained fighter by Earth standards. A former engineer with a penchant for martial arts as a hobby, he had stumbled into this situation through a series of events too improbable to recount without sounding like fiction. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that he was here, alone and unarmed, facing beings bred for war. Creatures with claws like scythes, muscles that rippled under armor like hides, and reflexes honed over centuries of combat. The crowd roared as the next match was announced. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of guttural cheers and alien languages that made Elias feel even more isolated. His opponent stepped forward, a hulking beast from the planet Grakthar, its four arms flexing as it bared rows of serrated teeth in what could only be described as a predatory grin. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena in Korrath, but Elias didn't need a translation to understand the tone: derision. Why is he even here? That question hung in the air like an unspoken taunt. The aliens didn't see him as competition. They saw him as entertainment, a novelty act to break up the monotony of real battles. Elias took a deep breath and stepped into the ring. The ground beneath his feet vibrated slightly, a reminder that this entire structure floated above a sea of molten plasma. The arena's energy field shimmered around them, ensuring no one could escape until one combatant yielded or died. The Graktharian lunged first, its massive fists swinging down with enough force to crush bone into powder. Elias sidestepped just in time, feeling the rush of air as the blow missed him by inches. He didn't counterattack immediately. Instead, he moved lightly on his feet, circling his opponent and studying its movements. This wasn't just about strength. Elias knew he couldn't match these creatures in raw power. But humans had something else: adaptability. Years of sparring back on Earth had taught him to read an opponent's body language, to predict their moves before they made them. And right now, the Graktharian was telegraphing its attacks like an amateur. Another swing came, a wide arc aimed at his midsection. Elias ducked low and rolled forward, coming up behind his opponent. Before it could react, he delivered a sharp kick to the back of its knee joint. The creature staggered but didn't fall. Its hide was too thick for such an attack to do much damage. The crowd jeered at his feeble attempt, but Elias ignored them. He wasn't trying to win their approval. He was trying to survive. The fight dragged on longer than anyone expected. For every blow the Graktharian landed, and there were many, Elias managed to evade or deflect just enough to stay in the game. His agility frustrated his opponent, whose attacks grew sloppier with each passing minute. Finally, an opportunity presented itself. The Graktharian overextended on a punch, leaving its side exposed for just a fraction of a second. Elias seized the moment, delivering a precise strike to a nerve cluster he'd noticed earlier. A vulnerability most wouldn't have recognized unless they were paying attention. The beast let out a guttural roar and collapsed onto one knee. Elias didn't hesitate. He followed up with another strike to its temple, a move that would have been laughable against any other species but seemed oddly effective here. The creature slumped forward and didn't rise again. Silence fell over the arena. For several heartbeats, no one moved or spoke. Then came the sound, slow at first but growing steadily louder, of applause. It wasn't universal. Many in the crowd still looked on with disdain or disbelief. But some recognized what had just happened. Against all odds, this fragile human had defeated one of their own. Elias stood there, chest heaving and sweat dripping from his brow, as the announcer declared him the winner in tones that barely concealed their shock. This was only the first round. As he walked back to his corner of the arena, a small alcove where no one greeted him or offered congratulations, Elias allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. He hadn't come here expecting to win. Truthfully, he hadn't expected to survive past his first match. But now that he had, something inside him shifted. They might see him as an outsider, an anomaly, but he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for humanity's place in this galaxy. And if there was one thing humans excelled at above all else, it was defying expectations. The next match would be harder. He knew that much already. But for now, Elias Kane, the fragile one, had proven something undeniable. Humans were not to be underestimated. The second round came faster than Elias had anticipated. There was no time to rest, no time to recover from the bruises blossoming across his ribs, or the ache in his legs from constant movement. The karate tournament was designed to test endurance as much as skill, and the organizers clearly didn't care if the competitors were battered or broken. The moment his name was called again, he knew they were testing him, not just as a fighter, but as a spectacle. His next opponent was a creature unlike anything he'd seen before. Towering at nearly 3 meters tall, its body was a mass of sinewy muscle covered in chitinous plates that shimmered under the arena's harsh lights. It had no eyes, only a series of ridges along its elongated skull that seemed to pulse faintly. Its arms ended in jagged blades, natural extensions of its body that looked like they could cut through steel. The crowd erupted into cheers and guttural chants as the announcer introduced it. Vorik, the Blade Dancer. Elias swallowed hard. If the Gractharian had been a brute force challenge, Vorik was something else entirely, a predator designed for precision and speed. But Elias wasn't without his own weapons. He stepped into the ring, his bare feet pressing firmly against the smooth surface of the arena floor. His stance shifted subtly, knees bent, and arms raised in a guard position. This wasn't just instinct, it was discipline drilled into him over years of practice back on Earth. Muay Thai, the art of 8 limbs, had been passed down through generations of humans, and now it was about to face its ultimate test. The gong sounded, signaling the start of the match. Vorik moved like liquid death, its bladed arms slicing through the air with a whistle that made Elias's skin crawl. He dodged back just in time to avoid being bisected, but Vorik didn't stop. It pressed forward with relentless aggression, each strike faster and more precise than the last. Elias couldn't afford to stay on the defensive for long. He pivoted sharply on his heel and launched a teep kick, a straight thrust aimed at Vorik's midsection. The impact landed with a dull thud, forcing the alien back half a step, but doing little more than annoying it. "All right," Elias muttered under his breath, resetting his stance. "Let's see how you handle this." He moved in close this time, weaving under Vorik's sweeping strikes with footwork that felt almost instinctual. His elbows came up sharply, one slamming into Vorik's ribcage with enough force to crack its chitinous armor, the other deflecting an incoming blade just inches from his face. He followed up with a knee strike aimed at what he hoped was a vulnerable joint in its leg. The alien let out a high-pitched screech, a sound that sent shivers down Elias's spine, but it staggered slightly, confirming his suspicion. Even creatures like Vorik had weak points. The crowd roared again, though whether they were cheering for him or for Vorik's retaliation wasn't clear. It didn't matter. Elias stayed focused, his movements fluid and deliberate as he unleashed the full arsenal of Muay Thai techniques. A roundhouse kick connected with Vorik's side, sending it skidding across the arena floor. Before it could recover fully, Elias closed the distance and drove an elbow into its jawline, or what he assumed was its jawline, followed by another devastating knee strike to its torso. Vorik lashed out wildly in response, one of its blades catching Elias across the shoulder. Pain flared instantly as blood seeped through his torn shirt, but he gritted his teeth and refused to back down. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving that humanity's strength wasn't limited to brute force or advanced technology. It was about heart, about resilience. The fight dragged on longer than anyone expected. Vorik's movements grew slower as Elias continued to target its joints and weak spots with relentless precision. His own body screamed in protest with every strike he delivered, his muscles burning from exhaustion and his vision blurring slightly from blood loss. But he refused to stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Vorik faltered. One of its legs buckled under the strain of repeated attacks, and Elias seized the opportunity with everything he had left. He leapt into the air, a flying knee strike aimed directly at Vorik's head, and felt a satisfying crunch as his attack connected. The alien collapsed in a heap on the arena floor. For several agonizing seconds, there was silence again. Then came the sound of applause, louder this time than before, as the announcer declared him victorious once more. Elias swayed slightly on his feet, but managed to stay upright as he made his way back to his corner of the arena. His shoulder throbbed where Vork's blade had cut him. He needed to find some way to patch it up before the next round began. But despite the pain and exhaustion threatening to overwhelm him, Elias couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride deep within his chest. They might call him the fragile one, but now they were starting to see what humanity could do when pushed to its limits. And this was only the beginning. The third round was different. The air in the arena felt heavier, as if the collective weight of the crowd's anticipation pressed down on Elias. His victories had shifted the atmosphere. He was no longer just a curiosity or a joke. He was a threat, and the karate didn't like threats. His next opponent stepped forward, and Elias immediately knew this fight would be unlike the others. The creature was massive, even by alien standards, a towering quadrupedal beast with thick, corded muscles and a hide that gleamed like polished obsidian. Its 4 eyes glowed faintly, scanning him with a predatory intensity that made his skin crawl. 2 massive arms ended in clawed hands that flexed rhythmically, as if eager to tear him apart. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena, introducing the alien as Korrath of the Warborn, but Elias barely heard it. His focus was on the way Korrath moved, slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. This wasn't an opponent that relied on speed or finesse. It was pure power, designed to crush anything in its path. Elias adjusted his stance as the gong sounded, signaling the start of the match. He didn't rush in this time. Instead, he waited, watching as Korrath lumbered toward him with heavy, earth-shaking steps. The first attack came suddenly, a sweeping strike from one of Korrath's massive claws that forced Elias to dive to the side to avoid being flattened. The sheer force of the blow cracked the arena floor where he'd been standing moments before. "All right," Elias muttered under his breath as he scrambled back to his feet. No trading blows with this one. He darted around Korrath, staying just out of reach as he studied its movements. The creature's size made it slow to turn, and its reliance on brute strength left openings that a more agile fighter could exploit. But how could he bring down something so massive? Then it hit him: leverage. Jiu Jitsu wasn't about strength. It was about using an opponent's size and momentum against them. It was about control, about finding ways to neutralize even the most powerful adversaries through technique and precision. And if there was ever a time to put those principles to the test, it was now. Korrath lunged again, its claws swiping at Elias with terrifying speed for something so large. This time, instead of dodging away, Elias moved in close, slipping under its arm and grabbing hold of its thick wrist. Using its momentum against it, he pivoted sharply and twisted, forcing Korrath off balance for just a moment. That moment was all he needed. Elias climbed onto Korrath's back with surprising agility, hooking his legs around its torso to secure himself in place. The creature roared in fury and thrashed wildly, trying to shake him off, but Elias held on tight. He worked quickly, his arms snaking around Korrath's thick neck, or what passed for a neck on this alien anatomy, and locking in a position for a rear naked choke. His biceps pressed against one side of its throat while his forearm crushed down on the other, cutting off blood flow to its brain. Korrath roared again and staggered backward, slamming into the arena walls in an attempt to dislodge him. Pain shot through Elias's ribs as he absorbed the impact, but he refused to let go. He tightened his grip even further, his legs squeezing like a vice around Korrath's midsection to maintain control. The crowd erupted into chaos, some cheering wildly for the spectacle unfolding before them, others shouting in disbelief or outrage at what they were witnessing. A human, a fragile human, was subduing one of their mightiest warriors with nothing but technique and determination. Korrath's movements grew more frantic as oxygen deprivation began to take its toll. Its thrashing became weaker and less coordinated until finally, after what felt like an eternity, it collapsed onto its knees with a heavy thud. Elias didn't release the choke immediately. He held on for several more seconds to ensure Korrath was truly unconscious before finally letting go and rolling off its back. He landed on the ground in a heap, gasping for air and clutching his bruised ribs as medics rushed onto the field to tend to his fallen opponent. The announcer's voice rang out once more, declaring him victorious yet again. But this time, there was no silence from the crowd. Only deafening cheers mixed with angry shouts from those who couldn't believe what they'd just seen. Elias lay there for a moment longer, before pushing himself up on his shaky legs. His body screamed in protest with every movement, but he forced himself to stand tall as he raised one fist into the air, a silent declaration that humanity was far from fragile. As he limped back toward his corner of the arena, he couldn't help but smile through the pain. They still didn't understand what made humans dangerous, but they were starting to learn, and Elias Kane wasn't done teaching them yet. The fourth round loomed like a storm on the horizon. Elias could feel the tension in the air as he stood in his corner, his body battered, but his spirit unbroken. The medics had done what they could to patch him up. His shoulder was wrapped tightly, and the bruises across his ribs were numbed with some alien salve that smelled like burnt rubber. But the pain was still there, a constant reminder of how close he had come to being crushed in the last fight. Yet, despite everything, he was still standing. And now, the crowd wasn't just watching him with curiosity or disdain. They were watching with something else. Respect? Fear? He couldn't quite tell. The arena floor trembled as his next opponent entered. The crowd erupted into a frenzy, and Elias turned to see what he was up against this time. His breath caught in his throat. The alien was enormous, easily 9.2 feet tall, and built like a living fortress. Its skin was a deep, mottled green, with thick plates of natural armor covering its chest, shoulders, and limbs. Four glowing yellow eyes stared down at him from a head that seemed almost too small for its gargantuan body, giving it an unsettling appearance. Its hands were massive, each finger tipped with claws that looked sharp enough to rend steel. The announcer introduced it as Korrath the Unyielding, and from the way the crowd chanted its name, it was clear this creature was a favorite. Korrath stepped into the ring with deliberate slowness, each step shaking the ground beneath them. It didn't roar or posture like some of the other competitors. It simply stared at Elias with an intensity that made his skin crawl. This wasn't just another fight for Korrath. It was a hunt. Elias took a deep breath and stepped forward as the gong sounded. He knew better than to try to match Korrath in strength or size. That would be suicide. Instead, he would have to rely on speed, precision, and every ounce of technique he had left in his battered body. Korrath moved first, lunging forward with surprising speed for something so large. Its massive hands swung down in an arc that could have flattened Elias where he stood if he hadn't rolled to the side at the last second. The impact left a crater in the arena floor, sending shards of stone flying in all directions. Elias scrambled back to his feet and immediately closed the distance between them, aiming a low kick at Korrath's knee joint. The strike landed with a dull thud, but didn't seem to faze the giant alien at all. If anything, it only seemed to irritate it. "All right," Elias muttered under his breath as he backed away again, narrowly avoiding another devastating swipe from Korrath's claws. Plan B. He switched tactics, darting around Korrath in quick bursts of movement designed to keep it off balance. He targeted its legs and sides with rapid strikes, low kicks, sharp elbows, and even a spinning back fist when he saw an opening. But nothing seemed to penetrate its thick armor-like hide. Korrath let out a low growl and charged at him again, this time faster than before. Elias barely had time to react, as one massive hand closed around his torso like a vice and lifted him off the ground. Panic surged through him as Korrath squeezed tighter, crushing the air from his lungs. He struggled against its grip, twisting and kicking wildly in an attempt to break free, but it was like trying to fight against a hydraulic press. Then he remembered something, a technique he'd seen during his training back on Earth, but had never thought he'd need to use in real combat. He reached up with both hands and grabbed hold of one of Korrath's massive fingers, pulling it back as hard as he could while simultaneously twisting his body to create leverage. The maneuver didn't break Korrath's grip entirely, but it loosened enough for Elias to slip free and drop back onto the arena floor. He hit the ground hard but rolled immediately to avoid another crushing blow from Korrath's fist. His chest burned from lack of oxygen, and every muscle in his body screamed in protest as he forced himself back onto his feet. This wasn't working. He needed another approach, something unconventional. As Korrath turned toward him again, Elias noticed something. Despite its size and strength, its movements were slightly sluggish when forced to pivot quickly. Its sheer mass made it difficult for it to change direction once committed to an attack. A plan began to form in Elias's mind, a risky one that would require perfect timing and precision, but might just give him an edge against this towering behemoth. He set his feet firmly on the ground and raised his fists once more, staring up at Korrath with defiance burning in his eyes. "Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth as adrenaline surged through his veins. "Let's dance." Korrath roared, the sound reverberating through the arena like a thunderclap. The crowd was on its feet, screaming for blood, but Elias tuned it all out. His world narrowed to the towering alien in front of him, each movement of its massive frame telegraphed like a slow-motion warning. He couldn't overpower it, but he didn't have to. He just needed to be smarter. As Korrath charged again, Elias didn't retreat. Instead, he darted forward at the last possible second, slipping under its outstretched arm and delivering a sharp elbow strike to the back of its knee. The alien stumbled, its massive frame shifting awkwardly as it tried to regain balance. That was the opening Elias had been waiting for. With a burst of speed, he leapt onto Korrath's back, wrapping his legs tightly around its torso and locking his arms around its thick neck. It was a dangerous gamble. If Korrath managed to throw him off, it would likely be the end, but Elias trusted his training. He adjusted his grip and began applying pressure, using every ounce of strength left in his battered body. Korrath thrashed wildly, slamming into the arena walls and clawing at Elias's arms in a desperate attempt to break free. But Elias held on, tightening the choke with precision born from years of practice. Slowly but surely, Korrath's movements grew weaker, its massive limbs flailing less violently until finally it collapsed. The arena went silent as the great Korrath the unyielding fell face first onto the ground, unconscious. Elias rolled off its back and lay there for a moment, gasping for air as the announcer declared him the victor. The crowd erupted into chaos, some cheering wildly, others booing in outrage, but none could deny what they had just witnessed. Elias Kane had defeated yet another of their champions. But there was no time to celebrate. Word spread quickly through the arena that Elias's next fight would be his last, the final round of the tournament. His opponent? The reigning champion of Korrath Prime, an undisputed greatest fighter in the galaxy, Zalzorak. Zalzorak was a legend even among the Korrati. Standing nearly 8 feet tall with a lean but muscular frame covered in intricate tattoos that seemed to glow faintly under the arena lights. He exuded an aura of calm confidence that made him even more intimidating than any brute force competitor Elias had faced so far. His movements were fluid and precise, every step calculated, as if he were already 10 moves ahead of his opponent. When Zalzorak entered the ring, the crowd fell into an almost reverent hush. This wasn't just a fight. It was a spectacle, a clash between two warriors who represented entirely different worlds. Elias stood across from him, battered but unbroken. He could feel every ache and bruise on his body screaming for rest, but he pushed it all aside. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about proving something, to himself, to humanity, and to every alien in that arena who had doubted him. The gong sounded. Zalzorak moved first, closing the distance between them with blinding speed. Elias barely managed to block the first strike, a spinning kick that sent shockwaves through his already bruised forearms, but he countered with a low kick aimed at Zalzorak's shin. The champion dodged effortlessly, his movements almost too fast for Elias to track. This wasn't like any fight Elias had been in before. Zalzorak wasn't just strong or fast, he was skilled. Every attack was precise and deliberate, designed to exploit weaknesses and force mistakes. For every strike Elias landed, and there were few, Zalzorak landed 2 in return. But Elias didn't give up. He adapted with each exchange, learning Zalzorak's patterns and adjusting his own tactics accordingly. He mixed Muay Thai strikes with Jiu Jitsu grapples, using every technique at his disposal to keep Zalzorak guessing. The fight dragged on longer than anyone expected. Both fighters were drenched in sweat and breathing heavily by the time they reached what felt like the final stretch. The crowd was on its feet again, roaring with excitement as blow after blow was exchanged in a flurry of movement too fast for most eyes to follow. Finally, an opening appeared, a split-second lapse in Zalzarak's defenses as he overcommitted to a high kick. Elias seized the opportunity with everything he had left. He ducked under the kick and closed the distance between them in an instant, wrapping his arms around Zalzarak's waist and taking him down to the ground with a perfectly executed double-leg takedown. Before Zalzarak could recover, Elias transitioned smoothly into mount position and locked in an armbar, a submission hold designed to hyperextend the elbow joint. Zalzarak struggled against the hold with all his might, but Elias held firm, applying just enough pressure to force him into a decision: tap out or risk permanent injury. For what felt like an eternity, Zalzarak resisted. But then, finally, he tapped. The gong rang out again, signaling the end of the match. The arena erupted into chaos once more as Elias released Zalzarak and rolled onto his back, staring up at the sky above with disbelief etched across his face. He had done it. Against all odds, against opponents stronger, faster, and more experienced than him. He had won. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena one final time: Elias Kane, champion of Korrath Prime. As he stood there in the center of the ring, battered but victorious, Elias felt something shift, not just within himself but within everyone watching. For centuries, humanity had been seen as weak and insignificant by much of the galaxy, a species barely worth acknowledging. But now they had a champion who had proven otherwise. Elias raised his fist high into the air as cheers erupted around him from even those who had doubted him before. Humanity wasn't just surviving anymore. It was thriving.